Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championships, which are taking place in Astana, Kazakhstan. Now, yesterday there was quite a bit of drama in the Rapid portion when Magnus Carlsen decided to sit out in the final round and not play against Hans Niemann. And today, the Blitz portion starts and the drama starts anew. So, as you'll notice from the game itself, which we have up on the screen, we have Hans Niemann playing against Nepomniachtchi. Now, the Blitz format is slightly different. It was not an all-play-all over many rounds. There was a pool stage where a certain number of teams qualified, and then immediately was quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals with a knockout portion. So here we see once again that Magnus Carlsen decides not to play against Hans Niemann, and instead we have Nepomniachtchi playing. And it's very clear at this point that Magnus has no interest in playing against Hans, pretty much unless he has to. Now, as this is a team event, and as I stressed yesterday, Magnus is allowed to sit out games. There are reserve players, and so he is not required to play. But if they are paired in another event, like the Speed Chess Championship, there will be a face-off. So let's jump right into the action. So this is the first of a couple of Blitz games we're going to look at, and Hans with the white pieces opens with d4. Get knight to f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and now Hans decides to play g3. Now, yesterday Hans actually opened with the move e4 in the rapid game, and after e5, knight f3, and knight f6, Hans made some very interesting gestures. He was basically looking at Nepo as though Nepo were an idiot. Like, why would Nepo try to play the Petrov instead of trying to beat Hans? Now, what Hans is doing, in my opinion, is Hans is trying to use his reverse psychology, build up this image, this bad boy image, and hope that really strong players will go out of their way and try really hard to beat him, when in fact I think the opposite is true. Most strong players feel zero urge to try very hard against him, and they would rather simply make quick draws or not play him at all. So we get back to this position after d5 here. Hans plays g3, deciding to play the Catalan. When you do play an opening like the Catalan, all the pieces stay on the board and the chances of simplifying are much lower. We get bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, d takes c4, queen c2, and now we have the move a6. Here Hans plays the move a4. Already a6 is a slight departure. Nepo in his world championship match against Magnus did play this move b5 in one of the games, but this move leads to a situation where black has zero chance to win and only white can win. Additionally, we covered the Hans game against Ding, which featured b5, so Nepo does not want to play the same variation. So we get a6. a4, bishop d7, queen takes c4, bishop c6 is played here by Nepo. Nepo wants to blunt the force of the light square beyond g2. Here we get to move bishop f4, bishop d6 is played, queen c1, knight bd7, knight c3, and now we have the move knight d5. All these moves pretty standard. Sometimes I forget when I do these recaps for you guys that the players are not at a GM level, and so I'm trying a little bit to simplify it a bit more. Most of these moves are pretty standard. A lot of what's going to happen in this game will revolve around the central pawn push or the big white center if white can get it with pawns on e4 and d4. We get bishop g5, queen to e8 is played, Hans goes rook e1, preparing to play the move e4. If white were to play e4 right away after the trade and bishop takes e4, black is simply up a pawn. So we get the move rook to e1. h6 played here by Nepo, bishop d2, we get takes, and now we have the move bishop e4 being played. Very simple move because white wants to play e4 and build the big white center. So we get bishop e4. Now we have a5 being played by Hans. We get queen to e7, knight to h4, bishops come off the board, and now we have the move c5. Here Hans goes e4, building the big white center with the pawns on e4 and d4. We get the trade of the pawns, and now we have the move bishop b4. A nice move by Nepo here, exchanging the b's off the board, because in the long run these pawns could become a little bit weak in the center, but also this pawn on a5 could be a little bit loose as well. And if black can simply set up with the rooks on d8 and c8, for example, just to illustrate the point, something like this even, you'll notice that the rook is on the open c file here, the rook on the d file is very active, and both these pawns can become weaknesses. So we get the move rook b1. Bishops come off the board, we get knight to f6, and here Hans plays knight f4. Now I'm a little bit surprised that Hans played knight f4 when he could have played a move like queen b4, forcing queens off the board, and now black has this very weak pawn on b7. You cannot go b5 because of end peasant with pawn takes pawn, and after rook fd8, it feels like after a move like f3 or maybe even e5, knight e5, and rook b7, white might have a very slight pull here. Instead, Hans plays knight to f4, we get rook fd8, now we have rook to b6, and here we get the move rook a c8. Now we have d5 being played, and we get queen to c5. Now Hans here has to make a decision in the center of the board because the knight and the rook are both targeting these pawns. Black also controls the file. Say you play a quiet move like h3, black has e5 here to strike in the center of the board, or even a move like rook to c4, putting massive pressure on these two pawns. So Hans goes all in with e5. We get queen to c5 being played. One thing that I will stress about Blitz is very important as well is to pay attention to the clock. Now what we're seeing here is that Hans is down on the clock and Nepo is moving at a very fast pace here. He's up over a minute on the clock. However, this is a little bit similar to the recent SEC match that Maxime Vassiliou and Hans played, where Hans actually was getting very low on time in a lot of the games, but he was able to sort of recover, find some good moves with 5 to 6 seconds, and actually turn some of those games around and win them. So after queen c5, we get to move rook takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, Hans goes to e5, and now we have the move knight to e4. We get queen to e2, rook to e8 being played, logical move to pressure the pawn on e5. Here Hans plays rook to d7, and now Nepo plays this move queen c6. You're probably thinking, wait, can't you just take the juicer and guard the pawn on d5? But you cannot do that, because now after knight to d3, this knight is forking the rook and the queen, and even though you sack the rook, white can take this pawn on a6, and white should be winning. So we get the move queen to c6, and here Hans goes queen g4. Hans cannot actually take this pawn because a Nepo's knight is forking with knight to c3. It forks the queen and the rook. So it's a very unusual situation where if black takes, there's this fork, and if white takes, there's this fork. So it's a very strange situation where you have to be careful of these knights and all the forking abilities. So after queen c6, we get to move queen to g4 from Hans, which is a pretty serious mistake here. Computer prefers to move rook to a7, targeting the pawn on a6. And after rook takes e5, if white plays a move like rook takes a6, for example, queen d7, and then something quiet like I guess king g2, white should not be in any trouble or in any danger of losing. Instead, Hans plays the move queen to g4. This is a move where he doesn't have a lot of time. He has to make a quick decision. And now Nepo is able to take the pawn on e5. Here Hans plays the move rook takes pawn, the best move in the position. If black were to trade the rooks and then take the knight, you would lose this rook on c8 and the game with it. So we get this move rook c8, knight h5, knight g5 is played. We get these trades, and now we have the move knight to f3. We get to move queen takes knight, queen takes, and at this point the game has simplified into a situation where black should be winning. Now keep in mind here that in this position, after knight to f3, if white moves the king anywhere else, king f1, there's knight h2, forking the king and the queen. Go to g2, it's another fork of the king and the queen. Go to h1, same problem, and white loses the game. So Hans has to sack the queen, but now with 3 seconds on the clock versus 1 minute, the rest is pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to go through it in depth, but eventually Nepo is able to start pushing the pieces around the board. Hans gets the knight trapped on the edge. He could have played something like, I guess, knight to h3 maybe, although I think this is also losing because of checking queen c6. But he goes knight to h5 here. We get queen f3, check, king h7, rook here, takes, and the game will conclude in short order. All that Nepo really has to do here is open up the king side. You got queen f3 being played here, rook a6 takes, a7, queen a3, and now we have rook to b7 being played. Here we have king g7, rook to c7, and after h3, black is simply winning here because at this point black will play queen to f3 and queen to g2. Checkmate. So Nepo wins his first game in the pool stage. Now both teams would advance to the knockout stage, and in the first game of the knockout stage we would once again have Hans versus Nepo. Now in a shocking twist of fate, it would turn out that the first game would not be relayed. Now Hans would win this game, but I have looked all over the internet. I even saw this tweet from Anish, which I will pop up briefly, where you see Anish's tweet about how when there was no relay, Hans would win the game. Now I checked multiple places, and I also checked the YouTube video from the official FIDE stream, and there was nothing. There is no record of the game. There is no record of the game. There are no videos. I haven't seen anything from ChessBase India itself. Now Hans would win this game, win the first game, but unfortunately don't have a record of that game, or I would show that game as well. So what we're left with is to show the third and final encounter of the day between Nepo and Hans, because once again Magnus Carlsen did not play. Now I will stress, Magnus played every other game in the Blitz today except for the 3 games against TeamGMHikaru.com. So Nepo opens with c4. We get knight to f6, knight c3, e5 is played. We have knight f3, knight c6, and now we get to move g3. Here Hans plays knight d4, bishop g2. We get the trade of the knights. Keep in mind, if white were to go knight e5 after queen to e7, white is actually in a lot of trouble. If you move the knight, there's spaghetti. Knight f3 would simply be checkmate. So we get bishop g2. We have knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, bishop b4 is played, and now we get to move queen b3, and here Hans plays a5. Now it's worth noting this is a system that none other than the famous streamer Hikaru Nakamura himself started playing around the time of the World Cup, and then the candidates as well. It's a system that he somewhat pioneered with bishop b4 and a5, so it's clear that Hans thinks that he is Hikaru. So after a5 we get castles, castles. Now we get to move rook d1, rook to e8, d4, e4, bishop g2, and here Hans plays h6. Now this is a very logical move to stop white from putting the bishop on g5 to pin the knight on f6. If you play a move like d6, bishop g5, suddenly there's a lot of pressure towards this pawn on e4. So we get h6. Nepo plays bishop f4, we get the trade, and now we have the move d6. Now the reason Nepo captured the pawn here, by the way, is he wants to play c5 down the road. Let's just say d6, c5 here, which actually happens in the game to open up the diagonal, but also he wants this open b file for the rook. We get c5, d5, rook b1. Now we have rook to a7 being played. Not rook b8 from Hans, because I assume he is worried that after c4 he cannot play c6 as he would hang the rook on b8. So we get the move rook a7, c4, takes, knight d5 played here, and now we have the move bishop e5. Hans goes bishop f5, developing the bishop and guarding the pawn on e4. And now Nepo plays the move c6. We get pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and now we have f6 being played, and Nepo goes queen c5, attacking this rook on a7. We have rook to a6 being played, and now Nepo is able to play this great tactical shot, bishop takes pawn on c7, because if black takes with a knight, you lose the bishop, and now if we do the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, white has one extra pawn, and if you take with the queen, you lose the horse on d5, and after bishop e6, and I guess queen e4, white is simply up 2 pawns here, and should be winning the game in short order. So, you get the move queen to d7, now we have rook d to c1, king h7 played here by Hans. We get bishop takes pawn. At this point, white is up 2 pawns and black is in serious trouble. We get e3. Now we have rook b2, which is also a mistake, by the way. Here, what Nepo should have done is he should have played this move bishop takes d5, sacking the rook on the b1 square. I don't know if black should take on f2 or b1 first. Let's just say takes here. And white does not capture, because after bishop takes b1 and rook b1, there's queen f5 check, hitting the king and the rook. And after bishop f3 and queen takes b1, black suddenly has 2 rooks for 2 bishops, and Hans will actually end up with a winning score against Nepo on the day. So after takes, king to f1, bishop b1 here, rook takes b1. White is simply winning. Probably Nepo is worried about check. You can't take again because of queen f5 check, bishop to g2, queen takes h2, but after queen f5 check, king h8, and king takes f2, queen guards the bishop, king guards the pawn and the bishop. Rook h1 is also a threat here, and white is winning the game. Instead, Nepo plays rook b2. We got takes, and now knight to e3 is played. And as you can tell from the evaluation bar, white is actually in a lot of trouble here because this knight and rook are very active. Black can stack the 2 towers, and it's very, very tricky to play. So Nepo goes bishop f3. Here we get this move bishop to e4, which is a very big mistake. What Hans should have played here is he should have spotted the tactic with rook takes bishop, sacking the rook, and after queen takes and queen d4, suddenly the knight guards the bishop on f5. The queen is hitting the king and the rook. You have a triangle here, and some kind of really bad fossil is going to happen. If white plays a move like, let's just say rook b5, for example, there's knight c4, checking the king on f2 with the queen, and then winning the queen on a5. If white plays a move like queen c3, there's knight d1, double check, and you hit the queen and the rook and the king, and it is GG. Why not? So if Hans had found this sacrifice, he would have won the game, but at the end of the day, Hans with only 5 seconds on the clock ends up playing this move bishop e4, which is a mistake. Now this goes to show one of the big differences also between online and over the board, that when you're playing online, I feel that in general you're looking for tactics, you're looking for sacrifices much more. I know for myself, I definitely feel like I'm much better at spotting them low on time specifically, because you're sort of anticipating. You're really in the moment because you're so used to always being low on time in blitz games online, whereas over the board it is quite different. So after bishop to e4 is played, we get king takes knight. Nepo does not see the boogeyman here. He simply eats the horse, and now Hans is actually in a lot of trouble. Hans trades the bishops, and now he plays queen h3, and with Hans being down a bishop, he is going to lose the game. Computer still says here that black sacks the rook with rook takes bishop here. If white were to play queen takes rook in this position, black is bishop g6, checking the king, and after king f2, queen d4 check, hitting the king and the rook. Let's just say king f1 takes, and I don't know, rook e1, for example. White has one extra pawn on a2, but due to the weak king, these weak pawns on a2 and e2, and the passive rook on e1, black should not really be in any trouble. But Hans with 4 seconds he's got to move, and he ends up trading. We get queen h3, and now after e4, there's simply nothing for black in the position. The h5 square is covered by the queen. White has queen f5 as well, and the h2 pawn is also guarded by the rook. We get king h8, bishop c7, rook e6, rook e1, f5 played here, and now Nepo goes bishop to e5, creating a very nice wooden shield here on e5. Very importantly, this pawn guards the bishop, and now Hans can pretty much resign. We get king h7, rook b7 played here, threatening the mate on g7. We get rook g6 being played, and here queen c2. f4 played by Hans. Nepo plays bishop takes pawn. We get rook to f8, and now we have this move e5, opening up the long diagonal towards the rook and the king. Hans plays queen g4. We get king to e3. King g8 is played as the queen guards the rook, and after rook to b1, we get to move rook takes bishop. Hans decides to sack the rook, hoping for some kind of miracle, but alas, there is not one. We get pawn takes rook, queen h3, king to e4, rook g2, and now we have the move queen d3, and after queen e6, we get d5, queen g6, and king to d4, and here Hans Niemann resigns the game in view of the fact that if he doesn't trade the queens, let's just say he goes, actually, where does he go? If he goes queen e8, there's rook to b8, which simply wins the queen. If he goes queen to h5, I guess, there's rook b8, king f7, and then rook 1 to b7. King is simply stuck, no squares available, and this would also be a checkmate. And obviously, last but not least, if you were to trade the queens here, white has an extra rook, a bunch of extra pawns that can go up the board, and there's no hope unless you're playing for the flag. But with increment, that does not apply in this situation. So Nepo ends up winning this game. He scores 2 points out of 3 against Hans in the Blitz today. It is a big pity, of course, that we don't get to see Hans playing Magnus. But as I say at the start of the video, I have the opinion that unless they're forced to play in some event, if Magnus has the option, he is simply going to choose not to play against Hans, as we saw from the fact there were 4 opportunities here, and Magnus chose to sit out each one of them. Of course, that is his right. This is a team event. There are reserves and everything else, but it definitely is a little bit disappointing that we end up getting this anticlimactic match between Nepo and Hans. But nonetheless, the show goes on, and I'm sure that at some point down the road, the pairing will occur, or I think it will occur, if Hans continues on his path towards becoming the first American World Chess Champion. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the final, or actually, sorry, I was about to go right into the final bit, but before I go into that, I was going to say, to give you guys an idea of the standings, since I did not mention that, the WR team did run away in the Blitz portion with Magnus, with Nepo, with Prague, I believe Noterbeck as well. The WR team ran away. They did win the gold medal in the Blitz portion of the event, despite the disappointed Rapids. So all's well that ends well for the WR team. So I did want to add that Hans' teams did not finish all that high in either the Rapid or the Blitz, but still Hans got an opportunity to play against some of the best players in the world. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the final day of the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship being held in Kazakhstan. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back soon with some more great recaps from all the great chess events around the world. See you guys. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.